Welcome, and thanks for joining us on CBSNews.com. I'm Norah O'Donnell. The overwhelming majority of scientists in the world agree there is a looming climate disaster. The rising temperature of the globe has been linked to more frequent severe storms. That's why Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, is now determined to get the world to take revolutionary change to save our warming planet. In his new book called How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, that's his new book. It's out today. Mr. Gates, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to talk to you.
Good to see you. So why do you believe that climate change is the toughest challenge humanity will ever face?
Well, most things we do physically, making steel, cement, as we transport ourselves in planes or cars, all of these activities involve emitting greenhouse gases. And so the scale of the change where we've set ourselves a goal of having this all done and getting to zero by 2050, that's very daunting. It's bigger than anything humanity has done to date.
We're going to dig into some of those details and some of the solutions you propose, but what are the consequences if we don't act now?
Yeah, unfortunately, as you put more and more CO2 in the atmosphere, it stays there for thousands of years and it drives the temperature up. And that makes those storms really bad. It destroys things like coral reefs. It causes wildfires. The sea levels go up. People who farm won't even be able to work outdoors during the day. And so particularly the poorest countries, you'll have tens of millions of people migrating north and causing civil wars and great unrest. So from a human point of view or a nature point of view, it's tragic if we can't limit those emissions and get them to stop.
Yeah, that's why we talked about that looming climate disaster, truly disastrous consequences. In fact, we're all familiar with the fallout from this global pandemic that we've now been living with for almost a year. And you write in the book, the loss of life and economic misery caused by this pandemic are on par with what will happen regularly if we do not eliminate the world's carbon emissions. You say regularly, you mean 500,000 Americans dead regularly if we don't deal with this climate disaster?
That's right. The death toll would be even worse near the equator, and the unrest, would be global in nature. And sadly, you couldn't just invent a vaccine, one thing, and get that out and bring it to an end because it's all these different sources. So you've got to start work now to avoid those terrible consequences much later.
One of the things that I learned new from your book, among many, is just how we emit greenhouse gases. And so we made a graphic to show everybody how we do that, including a third of it from how we make things. You mentioned cement, steel, and plastic. Electricity, 27%, 19% growing things, agriculture, plant, 16% transportation, and 7% keeping warm. And combined, all of these create about 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year. You are proposing that we reduce that to zero in 30 years. That seems virtually impossible.
It's a challenge. Anybody who thinks it's going to be easier, that we can get it done before that date, is not looking at the scope of the problem. But it's so important, and we have a young generation that cares about this, has it as almost a moral cause beyond their own individual success. And so if we orchestrate the right policies and the right innovators, based on my experience, we can succeed.
Yes, but you're suggesting that we have to change every single aspect of our lives. And I think that's why that graphic is so important, because it does touch on every single thing we do every single day. Electricity, I think that's probably the one that most of us, we flip on the light switch every morning or at night. We have all heard of clean energy. And you write in the book that if a genie offered you one wish to fight climate change, you'd pick a breakthrough in making electricity. How?
Well, the good news is that the cost of solar and wind has come down dramatically. We need to vastly accelerate how much we build that out. because we'll be using electricity for more things like the passenger car battery recharge, or instead of natural gas to heat your house, you'll use what's called an electric heat pump. And so the electricity sector is going to have to grow a lot. We still want it to be reliable. And that's tough because if you're weather dependent, you get long periods like a cold front that we see right now, where the wind and solar is not providing the energy. And so making sure we have enough storage or some non-weather dependent sources like nuclear, so that we're not freezing to death or boiling to death, that I highlight as one of probably the biggest challenge in this whole space.
Yeah, I mean, you brought it up, and that's where we wanted to go in talking about this, because the topic of electricity could not be more timely. Look at Texas. That's my home state where I grew up. More than 4 million customers are without power after this Arctic blast froze wind turbines. The Wall Street Journal today argues that this is the risk of trying to banish fossil fuels. Is what's happening in Texas a sign of the limits of clean energy like wind?
Basically, no. That is, if you have enough transmission so that, across the country, the wind is blowing somewhere and the sun is shining somewhere. If you have some degree of storage and some sources like nuclear that are not weather dependent, we can grow the electricity and maintain reliability. Now, it's not going to be easy. This is one where just looking at the price of solar alone doesn't tell you the challenge that we face. But we can get rid of those hydrocarbons for all of our electricity generation and still not freeze to death.
Yeah, but in Texas, which gets a fair portion of their energy from wind turbines, those wind turbines are frozen. And you hear energy officials in the state saying that is part of the problem.
You're right. A cold front over the Midwest that would shut down most of that wind and solar is the case that we need the nuclear and the storage for. And so we need more sources like offshore wind, which would not, shut down at the same time because it's very far away. Our grid is very tiny. In fact, Texas kind of has its own grid, but we need to connect Texas and the rest of the country together with a lot more capacity so that you use that diversity of sources as one of the ways you deal with reliability. And then for the remainder, you're either storing it, which isn't easy, or the nuclear reactors are running 24 hours a day.
So let me ask you, what lessons can we learn about what's happening in Texas? I mean, more than 4 million people without electricity.
Yeah, well, part of that problem is the transmission lines, get knocked down. Some of that we can innovate to go underground. People really take for granted how well electricity works. And it is true, the coal plants weren't weather dependent. They had, a lot of coal piled up there so they could keep running. And, the new sources don't work that way. So, great expertise, an open-mindedness to the new approaches, incentives for these companies. That's a sector that we can make completely green and show the world how to do it.
In fact, Bill, you write in the book that there is only one carbon-free energy source that can reliably deliver power day and night through every season that can work on a large scale, and that is nuclear fission. Is that the future?
We need to keep innovating there and make it dramatically safer and dramatically cheaper, because unless we get very surprised by some cheap way of storing energy, we will need that on-demand capability. And we have to start from scratch because today's reactors are very complex and they require operators to do the right thing. And so the U.S. government is funding a number of companies, including one I'm involved with, demonstration reactors that can show this breakthrough level of safety and low cost.
Fossil fuels are cheap. That's why they're used around the world, and they have been for decades. and I know you want to move towards eliminating them. But what happens to the 2.8 million Americans that are working in the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, fortunately, this is a 30-year transition, and there's lots of clean jobs that can be created in those same locations. In fact, over the next decade, as we're building the new infrastructure and continuing to use the hydrocarbons, the total number of jobs will actually go up. Moving hydrogen around the country, which is clean, there'll be great jobs there. The electricity sector being 3 times as big, building all those transmission lines, to taking CO2 and putting it into the same type of holes that we've been taking oil out of. We need the skill sets, the complex engineering capabilities, the unions with the trade skills. There may be some places there's dislocation, and so as we budget for the green energy, we have to think about those affected communities as well as funding the innovation and deployment. We've got to have a strong enough consensus that this becomes more of a bipartisan issue.
But just to level with everybody, it is going to cost more. I mean, that is one of the, and living in the United States of America and other modern economies, energy is incredibly cheap. It really is. And fossil fuels are incredibly cheap. But in order to change, to get more green energy, it is going to cost more. You call them green, or many people call them green premiums. Why would most Americans agree to pay more? Why would they agree to change if it's going to cost them more?
Well, let me use the example that we've made the most progress in, which is electric cars. Over the next 15 years, as the cost of the batteries come down, their capacity goes up, you get more charging points, you get quick 15-minute charging. The electric car won't have a green premium. That is, the overall cost won't be worse. Now, the government's incented this through a tax credit. Tesla and many of the companies are now focusing on making these cars. GM, when they decided that in 2035 they'll stop making gasoline cars, that's not because they think it's an inferior product. They think the green premium will have gone away in that category. And so that's what we need to do in all these categories. The transitional costs, like funding those tax credits for wind or electric cars, that's an enlightened policy, but with the right innovation, you get to the point where you can remove it, and put it on to the next area, like energy storage or cement or steel, that we still have a very high green premium. The extra cost to be green is way above zero.
I know we don't have enough time to get into that because that was the one that really expands the mind about cement and steel and how much construction is going to happen within the world even in the next decade. But I want to ask you, what do you think of Elon Musk's contribution then?
Well, he's contributed in many ways. The Tesla's a strong product. It's forced all the car companies to look at can they match what he's done there? He's also recently put out a challenge for what's called direct air capture that will be a part of the solution. And so, he was willing to entertain wild ideas. And we need, hundreds of Elon Musks, and that's how we'll get this done.
Mm-hmm. Agriculture, that is 1/5 of the cause in that chart that we showed everybody earlier. And you write, the American-style diet is responsible for almost as many emissions as all the energy Americans use. That takes a minute to really to digest that. What should we change in our diet? What have you changed in your diet?
Well, there are some Tesla equivalents here, people like Beyond Meat and Impossible, that are creating a category where instead of using a cow, they use proteins made in a factory. And so there's no animal cruelty, there's none of this greenhouse gas release, none of the manure. Now, they're like electric cars, they're a pretty small part of the market, 1 or 2%. But when the burger chains offered that as an option, even with a slightly higher price, the demand was very strong. And so as the volume of that goes up, those costs will come down and the quality will get to the point where you won't be able to tell the difference. You can still tell, but boy, have they made massive progress. And so, we're not telling people that you won't have any hamburgers in the future. For people who want to stop eating meat, that actually is helpful. But I don't think, we'll get to zero by asking everyone to be a vegetarian.
Right. And I know you're investors in both of those companies, Beyond Meat and Impossible Burger, but they do currently still need plants in order to make those foods. And I know you're invested also in a company that will create microbes that ultimately replace that is more green, just changing how our diet actually works. You talk to my kids. I have preteens, essentially, and they have learned about how much methane and cow flatulence contributes to climate change. You write in the book, I know probably much to Melinda's dismay, quote, burping and farting natural gas is a problem that's unique to cows. So that's the question, because kids ask it. Does that mean we have to end beef production? Does that mean we end eating steaks and hamburgers?
Well, there are people who are looking at how you feed the cows, or maybe you capture, the front or the back, and that is worth pursuing. There are people who don't like the animal cruelty, and so now this artificial meat type approach, they like that, not just from a greenhouse gas point of view. So those approaches are going to compete with each other. A lot of Americans will be eating burgers, forever. And so we need a way of making that that's not a lot more expensive and not inferior. And so it's very similar to the electric car learning curve. A little bit of subsidy, a little bit of, consumers driving up the volume because they care about climate will get us to the point where I believe that green premium will also be zero, that you just won't be able to tell the difference.
But I read in one of the interviews you gave in the last week or two, it was just published, you said rich nations should move to 100% synthetic beef.
Yeah, unless we can make the cow zero emission, which, I'm not sure we can, we do need to get rid of those emissions. And, it's not going to happen overnight. The scale up and the innovation still required there is quite large. But yes, zero is a very demanding number, and it doesn't allow you to say, well, all but, the 6% that comes from cows.
Mm-hmm. How do you address that? Because I can imagine people at home are saying, I'm not doing that. What he's talking about is crazy. I'm not doing that. We're not going to stop eating hamburgers. We're not going to stop. I work, I farm cattle. We're not going to stop doing that. I'm not going to change my way of life because of something that he's talking about is going to happen in 30 years. How do you address that?
Well, it's the same, for gasoline cars. The companies are seeing that they need to change. And it's phenomenal. GM, which is, created along with Ford, the global car industry, is now saying that, the gasoline engine days are numbered.
And Mary Barra and GM have also recognized that a younger consumer base is also going to want that product.
Exactly. This movement needs that generation to stay committed to this cause. Without that, we're not going to get there, because it does require ways to drive innovation. And it does, in some cases, require things being a bit more expensive as we get through this transition. And so this is going to be hard. It requires a lot of commitment. We can't go for 4 years and stop for 4 years. But the young generation, I think, will demand it.
Because of the advances in technology and many innovations, I have the ability to text directly with many people who watch my show and the evening news and watching this. And so we asked them what to ask you. And many of them asked the same question, which is, what can an everyday citizen do to prevent climate change?
Well, the most important thing is your political voice. Convincing people of both parties, figuring out who they might trust to listen on this topic. That's your biggest role, is to get this consensus about the goal, and then we can debate the tactics to achieve the goal. The second is, as a consumer, your car, your your beef, products will be labeled according to their emissions intensity, and you need to show a preference. Finally, the company you work for. We need corporate America, as they're buying things, as they're building new buildings, as they're having their employees fly around the world. We need them to devote some money to buying green aviation fuel, to doing their building projects and bootstrapping the demand for the green construction products. And so in all three roles, your voice will be critical.
How much, given that former President Trump withdrew from the global agreement known as the Paris Accords, how far did that set us back?
Well, the last 4 years, the Congress preserved the energy R&D budget, but ideally that would have been growing a lot. And we expect President Biden, who has a strong team of climate thinkers, that increasing the R&D budget will be one of many things he's able to do. Because we're the richest country in the world and because we've emitted far more than any other country historically, when we don't participate, the other countries are like, okay, this isn't going to happen. Why should we even try? The innovation power of the U.S. is the greatest of any country. And so other countries, really backed away from ambitious goals. And now we need to re-energize that. I'm glad that we're back in, but can we keep it constant?
Yeah, let's talk about which countries need to step up and lead, because you write about this in the book. In the last 2 decades, China has tripled the amount of coal power it uses. That's more capacity than in the United States, Mexico, and Canada combined. China shows no sign of slowing down.
Well, China's made a commitment to get to zero by 2060. Now, we'd like them to do that earlier. We'd like them to get rid of those coal plants, not build more coal plants either in the country or ones that they're financing in other countries. And so that'll be, a real relationship issue, is getting China and India, which, of course, almost 40% of people live in those two countries. Without their involvement in a deep way, enabled somewhat by U.S. innovation, we won't achieve the global goal.
Mm-hmm. I want to, for the climate doubters that may be watching, you lay out examples of how temperatures could rise across the globe if we don't do something and act quickly. One example is Albuquerque, New Mexico. It had 36 days of 90 degrees back in the 1970s. That city could see 114 days over 90 degrees by the end of the century. So Abby from Chicago texted me and said, why do you think so many are unconvinced climate change isn't a problem, and what can we do to help bring people along?
Well, you can't see CO2. It's completely invisible. And this idea that the heat gets trapped, is kind of a surprising thing, although you do see it in greenhouses where the sun goes in and then the glass stops it. The heat from going out, which is why it's got that name. The negative effects, the fact that a few degrees rise causes tornadoes and the sea level to go up, that's not intuitive to people. And of course, it hasn't been in our curriculum. Hopefully it'll motivate this generation to learn more about science, to understand these negative effects. So there's a lot of education required. I do think in the last 5 years, some of these extreme weather events, the heat waves, even the cold fronts like we're seeing now, that's what's helped us get the level of understanding up quite a bit. But, there's still maybe 20 or 30% who haven't had that exposure, and figuring out who do they trust, who would they listen to, what are the examples that really bring it home for them in terms of the negative effects in their community.
Let's turn now to the pandemic, because you warned more than a decade ago that we would face a global health crisis like we do today. And I know you have been friends with Dr. Fauci for a long time and you speak with him regularly. Do we need to create a new vaccine for these Brazilian and South African variants?
Yeah, the Gates Foundation was funding these studies in South Africa that looked at 3 of the vaccines and saw that their effectiveness was not as high against that variant. And similar variants are showing up around the world. And so the discussion now is, do we just need to get a super high coverage of the current vaccines, or do we need a third dose that's just the same, or do we need a modified vaccine? And all 5 of the companies that have U.S. Vaccines are looking at making that modification and adding that in so that people have already had 2 shots might need to get a third shot. I think it's reasonably likely that we will have a tuned vaccine just to make absolutely sure that as these variants hit the U.S., that they're not escaping from vaccine protection.
Well, you mentioned you are funding these trials in South Africa and Brazil, and I've read that the data is going to be available later this month. Is that right? And so,
yeah, we already were able to give the summary, which is that AstraZeneca in particular has a challenge with the variant, and the other 2, Johnson & Johnson Novavax, are slightly less effective, but still effective enough that we absolutely should get them out as fast as we can while we study this idea of tuning the vaccine.
When you say tune, do you mean that you would get a booster in addition to your first 2 shots, or in your next yearly set of vaccinations, you would get a totally new, just like a flu shot, an influenza shot, changes each year?
Yeah, both of those may be necessary if we can't eradicate it from all humans. If it's still circulating, we might need something that takes this new shape of the spike protein and is more tuned to that. So you might need a third shot this year. And then if it's still out there, we'll be looking at how your antibodies, how your protection goes down over time, and deciding how often you'll need another shot. Probably not yearly, but as long as it's out there, we want as many Americans as possible not to be spreading it to each other.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm most concerned about is misinformation that exists out there, trusted news sources. That's why we do what we do every day at CBS News. I know your family's concerned about it too. Your daughter, Jennifer, is a 24-year-old medical student. She got the vaccine, and she poked fun at conspiracy theories that baselessly claim that these vaccines plant microchips in people's brains, and wrote, "Sadly, the vaccine did not implant my genius father into my brain." But let me ask you, did you see it? Did you think it was funny?
I didn't see it before she did it, but I thought it was wonderful. It was very nice of her. I
have to ask you, but are you concerned about vaccine hesitancy? And let me ask you this. We now know, because of the additional 200 million doses that the Biden administration has secured, do you think we will reach herd immunity by July?
Yeah, so there's 3 constraints. There's the supply, there's the logistics, and there's the demand. And in the April-May timeframe, the supply and logistics will probably be good enough that will become demand limited. So your question is a super good question. Will the crazy negative rumors about the vaccine create enough hesitancy, along with the people who there are some who shouldn't take the vaccine because of immune deficiencies? Will that keep us below this herd level where you block all the immunity? And I think if we get trusted voices, particularly in minority communities, setting an example and speaking out about it, we can avoid that. But it's at risk. Right now, there are pockets, including the people who need it the most, where the resistance levels are very high.
Mm-hmm. I just have 2 more questions for you. I do want to ask you about the SolarWinds hack, the cyber attack that infiltrated the federal government and being traced back to Russia. Microsoft's President Brad Smith was on 60 Minutes. He called it the largest and most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen. How vulnerable do you think we are to a destructive cyber attack, and how much does that concern you?
Well, it's a huge issue. I'm no longer directly involved in it, but in a way, this is a wake-up call that our defenses aren't as good as we'd like. And, there's a particular pattern that we've got to block in the future. So I'm glad that, Microsoft is being open about it. All the companies really should do better to share information about what's gone on because, this could shut down lots of critical infrastructure in the future.
Final question. You've spoken with President Biden since he's moved into the White House and taken charge. Do you talk about climate change? Do you talk about the pandemic? What do you talk about?
Those are the big issues. When my wife Melinda's on the phone, some of the gender-related things about sick leave come up as well. But those three topics, we had great conversations. He's made ending this pandemic, being ready for the next one, right up there in the top four, along with climate and equity. And so, he's off to a good start. These are hard problems to solve, but, now we have smart people with the right goals in mind.
How often do you talk?
A lot of the discussions now have shifted to the cabinet level people. I was talking today with John Kerry, who's the climate envoy, which is great. And so things are becoming concrete enough. We'll probably touch base every 2 or 3 months just to highlight where, we see very good progress or where, we think things could move faster. He's good at picking smart people and delegating. That's, part of his strength.
Bill Gates, such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And Bill Gates's book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, is out today. Thank you.